As we told you in parts 1 and 2 yesterday, Idaho Freedom Foundation's influence affects what laws get passed in Idaho and the civility of the political process. For example, it impacted Idaho's higher education budget and preschool funding last session based on an unproven premise. There's another level to this story of the nonprofit, and it has to do with transparency. Yep. Morgan Romero now joins us here to talk again about this, to get into this aspect of this. Well, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, between the 501c3 and the 501c4 lobbying arm versus nonprofit. It really is concerning for lawmakers that I talk to, the lack of transparency. IFF and its lobbying arm, Idaho Freedom Action, are getting more and more donations every year. I dug into some tax forms which show in 2019, IFF raked in about $710,000. In 2020, they saw more than $1 million in contributions, grants, money from its lobbying organization. And get this, ironically, for an organization that really doesn't believe in the government, a PPP loan. But politically active nonprofits don't have to publicly disclose who donates or where their funding comes from, meaning dark money is influencing policy and political outcomes in our state. Prominent players in state politics say the Freedom Foundation really operates in this gray area. That's what we're hearing over and over again, crossing or at least blurring the line between what a nonprofit can and can't do under federal tax law and state campaign finance rules.
And it's a wide line, of course.
Yeah, it is.
And as we did yesterday, we all want to point out that, again, Idaho Freedom Foundation did not want to do an on-camera interview with us for these stories. They would have only agreed to do it if we aired an hour-long, unedited interview with them, and, well, that's not how this works.
And if you don't think the way they think, then they're going to bully you, and they're going to target you.
Conservatives Chuck Winder, currently Senate President Pro Tem, and Bob Geddes, who held the same position in the early 2000s, say the Idaho Freedom Foundation operates in a political realm where charitable organizations aren't allowed to dabble. When IFF formed in 2009, Geddes was leader of the Senate.
That they have stretched beyond just public information and public involvement.
He, Winder, and former Supreme Court Justice Jim Jones say IFF endorses candidates and sways legislation through intimidation tactics and through its Freedom Index, which rates bills and lawmakers.
So there's an awful lot of lobbying going on by the Freedom Foundation.
A lot of organizations have that same problem and tend to push those limits. I know of other organizations who keep score, for example, on bills that are important to their members, and I don't think that that's significantly bad. But I think it is, if it's carried too far, it's basically extortion. You either support us or we'll blacklist you.
Republican Representative Greg Cheney agrees they toe the line of legality.
Do you think that it is in the realm of a 501c3 nonprofit to have something like this?
No, it's absolutely lobbying activity. I think they understand perfectly well that they're influencing policy with their scoring.
But I certainly believe that their influence is more dangerous.
It's no secret that the Idaho Freedom Action and the foundation itself have a very significant impact on the processes that go on.
While he thinks IFF's Freedom Index has outsized influence, longtime public policy attorney and lobbyist Roy Aguirre doesn't think the nonprofit crosses the line with its scorecard.
As long as they don't use the magic words of endorse, support, those types of things. The law is very clear in that regard in terms of what the demarcation lines are between what constitutes political activity by way of endorsement and support versus education.
IFF's Vice President Dustin Hurst claims via email neither IFF nor its lobbying arm, Idaho Freedom Action, endorse or oppose candidates. He says Freedom Action will occasionally, quote, educate voters about incumbents and candidates' records, which some may interpret as support or opposition, but that's not the purpose. Instead, he calls posts and videos like this constituent education.
But Senator Jim Woodward killed legislation giving parents a real say in what schools teach.
According to the IRS, tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofits, like the Freedom Foundation, are limited in the kinds of activity they can legally do. They cannot make campaign contributions or campaign for or against political candidates. Under federal tax law, these charities can educate legislators, but they aren't supposed to influence legislation, contact lawmakers, or encourage voters to contact lawmakers as a substantial part of their activities. Although the IRS doesn't define substantial. Winder and several other lawmakers say this is where IFF crosses the line. They say the group's leaders, Wayne Hoffman and Fred Birnbaum, tell some representatives how to vote while they're on the floor.
And so there's some coordination there.
Pressuring them privately and publicly, unlike any other organization.
Messaging with lawmakers in their floor debates to get the sound bites they want for further influencing of policy and campaigning.
You can ask anybody around this building, they'll change their ratings in the middle of a hearing. They'll send out text messages, they'll send out emails, encouraging and telling people how they should vote. And
Legislators?
Yes, why they're in committees.
Eguren says the law is unclear around how much time and money 501c3s can spend on lobbying.
And it cannot be what's known as excessive lobbying.
Because the IRS doesn't clearly define excessive lobbying, the definition is subjective. It's up to the nonprofit to decide and the IRS to scrutinize. Eguren says, general rule of thumb in terms of money, nonprofits can't spend more than 20% of their total expenses on lobbying. IFF tax forms show the organization spent more than $17,000 on lobbying in 2020. But with almost $750,000 in expenses, that wound up only being 2.5% of their expenditures. To avoid federal lobbying limits and further its mission, the Freedom Foundation created an affiliate social welfare organization. Also tax-exempt, the group's 501c4 Idaho Freedom Action can lobby all it wants. And it can engage in some political campaigns, as long as that's not its primary activity. IFF and IFA share the same offices in downtown Boise, the same staff, and according to Secretary of State records, the same lobbyists down at the State House.
So it's a public policy determination that's been made by the federal government that 501c3s and 501c4s can be intermingled with staff, with resources, that type of thing.
While legal, there's little separation between the two.
It's hard to see where one stops and the other starts. And I think they've had a tremendous impact on the electoral process. And there's a lot of crossover between what the Freedom Foundation does in scoring the bills and in what Idaho Freedom Action does in supporting or opposing candidates.
To extend their reach, Eguren says,
it's not unusual.
It is common for charities to set up related organizations. For example, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and Sierra Club all have 501c4s. The IRS just requires they be very careful with their accounting and have separation between the two organizations, meaning the charity can't finance the lobbying arms activities that the charity is banned from doing. So far this session, Idaho Freedom Action is among the top 10 highest spending lobbying groups out of almost 600 companies. 5 other entities have spent more, with Texas-based Young Americans for Liberty shelling out a whopping $51,000 since January. Young Americans for Liberty was the second biggest spender last year in Idaho, with Idaho Freedom Action following in third. IFA spent more than $33,000 to influence legislation in 2021. But it's not just about money. While other organizations have spent more on lobbying, Cheney says they don't have the same grip on the legislature as IFF and IFA.
They understand perfectly well that what they're doing is when they're putting out social media information and other information, that they are affecting not only policy but also political campaigns in the process.
Critical race theory.
Some of what they put out to voters is proven flat out wrong.
Up to outrageous leftist classroom indoctrination.
Like claims certain lawmakers voted to pay for programs pushing critical race theory.
And put children first.
Public records show Idahoans are also concerned about IFF operating in a gray area. Idahoans filed at least 4 complaints with the state against the organization over the last 2 years. The Idaho Capital Sun reports the IRS also received at least 3 complaints about IFF. Complaints accuse the Freedom Foundation of breaking federal tax laws and Idaho campaign finance rules, with one Idahoan saying in a complaint to the state, quote, "They will continue to live in the gray area of the law if they are not put on notice." After an investigation, one complaint led to the state fining Idaho Freedom Foundation's VP, Dustin Hurst, $250 for lobbying on Idaho's higher ed budget without registering with the right organization first. They said he registered as a lobbyist for its charitable organization, IFF, but not IFA, the social welfare organization. It's up to the IRS to audit, to fully examine the truthfulness of a tax-exempt organization's mission.
To make a determination on whether excessive lobbying has in fact occurred.
But traditionally, Eguren says the agency has done little on that front, due to inadequate funding the last couple decades.
You can make a fairly strong case from a public policy standpoint, as well as a transparency standpoint, that in fact there should be a more clearly defined line between the types of activities a 501c3 versus a 501c4 engage in.
Yeah, again, I've said this twice. You've heard from people in there. Very gray area. We don't have deep insight into the group's accounting beyond those Form 990s I talked about. And unless an IRS investigation leads to a tax-exempt status being taken away or some sort of financial penalty, we won't know if the IRS is investigating a nonprofit for excessive lobbying or any other reason. So without a lot of government oversight in this sector and a lack of transparency, there is room for potential abuses in the nonprofit world. Hurst, the VP, told me IFF and IFA don't give money to campaigns, quote, unlike the special interests that seek to exterminate the freedom agenda, because I guess they don't define themselves as special interests. But after scouring campaign finance reports, I found some of the Freedom Foundation's directors do contribute. One example, Doyle Beck, Brian Smith, Brent Regan, all on the IFF board of directors, donated to Brandon Durst, a candidate for Secretary of State who's embroiled in a bit of a controversy right now and is under investigation. Federal Election Commission records show Wayne Hoffman, president of the IFF, donates to many campaigns and causes as well, namely Brian Smith for Idaho Inc. The vice chair of IFF is running against Republican incumbent Mike Simpson for Congress. So there are ways, we're trying to look for things that they're doing and how they're contributing in the political campaigns and their involvement. And we're finding little pieces here and there. But as you heard Egerin say, it's a blurry area.
And there's so much information you just brought us, Morgan. It's amazing. And if you missed any of that or want to see it again, you can find it online at KTVB.com. And coming up tonight on the News at 10, a bonus segment.
We hear from Take Back Idaho PAC. It's a group of veteran lawmakers who have come together and said, we want to fight extremists in the legislature. We want to really fight the Idaho Freedom Foundation. So they are working to finance, as a PAC, responsible, as they call it, responsible candidates who care about public education and infrastructure.
Morgan, thanks for all the work you've done so far on this. I can't wait to see what goes on tonight.
Thanks, Brian.
Just to offer some perspective on this, though, this series isn't something we just came up with out of the blue. It was sparked by a couple of things. One was what Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winters said back in June about his greatest disappointment of last legislative session being how many legislators were willing to follow the lead of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And we watched this play out as well, with bills and budgets being passed based on information that was not true. It seems every week or so, the last couple of months, another legislator or someone with skin in the political game was writing up an op-ed about the organization's message and or tactics. A message, like when it comes to critical race theory in our schools, has never been fully endorsed with actual evidence. How do we know this? Because we've spoken with teachers and administrators and students, and independent investigations into social justice indoctrination allegations in universities could not corroborate those claims. Just last week, parents and teachers in Idaho City confronted Representative Dorothy Moon after she claimed CRT is in the pre-K curriculum of Boise County schools. Well, they were angry. She was spreading a lie about them in a legislative committee. Her response? It was misconstrued by the media. Despite what they themselves saw and heard her say, she told them last week to just reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. You see, this is what should happen. Your elected officials should be held accountable for following false guidance without verifying it for themselves. And as we mentioned, we did try to speak to several lawmakers who are closely linked to the IFF, including members of the IFF. They all refused, and that's their choice. They have no obligation to us, but they do have an obligation to the people of Idaho, those they serve, and they should have to answer questions no matter who is asking them.